Hey everyone. So in this video, I'm going to discuss certain issues, general issues about knowledge and skepticism. And in the end, I'm going to draw a connection of my discussion to certain presuppositionalist arguments for the existence of God. Um, so yeah. So just as a general introduction, epistemology as a field of philosophy is concerned with knowledge, right? What is knowledge? How do we know things? What methods for coming to know things, if there are any, are most effective? Do we know anything at all? These are the sort of questions that are considered in epistemology. The epistemic nihilist, for example, says that we don't know anything, right? And perhaps knowledge isn't even possible in principle. Some skeptics would say the same thing, but since there's a family of views associated with the term skepticism, some of which wouldn't exactly say the same thing, I'm going to use the term epistemic nihilism as a label for the view just described. And so, with that in mind, this is my target question for today's video: do we know anything? Right? Is the epistemic nihilist correct when they say that we do not, or do we know things? So the first step to approaching this, for me anyway, is to get clearer on the question. Given how we're using the term know, what are the conditions under which we count or would count as knowing something? We could try to figure that out and then see if we could determine whether we satisfy those conditions, at least sometimes. If we do, then we know things. If we don't, then we don't. Seems pretty straightforward. Of course, it never is, but that's the basic strategy that I would want to employ. So, I mean, at this point, just getting started, there is an important distinction to make between different sorts of quote unquote knowledge. One kind, which is going to be our target here, is knowledge that propositional knowledge, knowledge of certain facts, right? Knowledge that is like knowledge that something or other is the case, right? We know that it's raining, that 1 + 1 = 2, and so on. Again, this is sometimes described as the knowledge that a certain proposition is true. And knowledge in this sense can be distinguished from, say, knowledge how, which is construed kind of roughly as a capacity of a certain sort. Someone might have the knowledge how to ride a bike, but that might not be, or might not be exhausted by certain propositional knowledge regarding bikes and so on. I'm not going to explore knowledge how any further here. It's not the target of my discussion. Moreover, there are certain other, sorts of things that are sometimes called knowledge in some sense, like acquaintive knowledge. And again, that's not the target of my discussion. So I'll not explore that any further right now. But just bear in mind that I'm talking about knowledge in this first sense, knowledge that, knowledge of a certain thing, and not these other senses of knowledge that we might have in mind. So, do you know that there is a star in our solar system? Do you know anything at all? That's what I'm trying to consider. And so, moving on, then, standardly, and although this, like most philosophical views, does not have unanimous support, but nevertheless, standardly, it's our beliefs that, in principle, could count or don't count as knowledge, right? You believe that there's a star in our solar system, but does your belief count as knowledge, right? In this video, I'm not going to be exploring more deeply what belief is, although that is surely worth exploring. For our purposes here, I'm just going to assume that as shared notion that we have beliefs and that can be true or false. And then we're asking whether they count as knowledge or not, and which ones do, if any. So yeah, standardly, it's our beliefs that can or perhaps don't count as knowledge. And usually it's assumed that, or it's thought that knowledge involves belief plus some other feature or features. So for one, it must be that the belief in question is true. If I know that there's a star in our solar system, it must at least be the case that I have the true belief that there's a star in our solar system. I can't know, for example, that there are 20 stars in our solar system when, in fact, there's only one. That doesn't really accord with how we normally use the term knowledge. Knowledge is what we might call factive. If you know P, it follows that P. If P were false, then accordingly you could not know that P. You can't know something which is not the case. Of course, someone might use the term knowledge in a way which needn't be factive, but I think that would be an unorthodox usage. Again, this sort of standard usage or more common usage will be such that knowledge is factive. So truth is a requirement for knowledge as normally used. So before proceeding, I do want to take a step back. So thus far, I've made some remarks about which sorts of things are standardly taken to be requirements for knowledge. However, even if these are fairly uncontroversial remarks, we might still ask how it is that these remarks are correct. More precisely, if I assert that knowledge requires true belief, perhaps among other things, what exactly has to be the case for my assertion to be correct? As I intend this assertion, at least, what has to be true is something about term use, right? And given how the term knowledge is being used, it follows that somebody counts as having knowledge only if they have true belief, right? It's some requirement for counting as having knowledge, as we're using the term, that they have true beliefs, perhaps among other things. That's simply how we're using the term. If someone didn't have any true beliefs, then on our use of the term, it's false that the person in question knows anything. So that's, in a way, you can think of this as this stage of the analysis is a sort of conceptual analysis, or, if you prefer, an analysis of how we're using the relevant terminology, right? Knowledge, and so forth. Now, this does present an immediate worry. People can use the same terminology differently, and the same people might even use it differently over time or in different contexts. And this is a real concern. I mean, so I think, did Plato use the term or the same way as some 5-year-old from Nevada? What about Timothy Williamson and Charles Darwin? What about people who speak languages for which there's no clear translation of epistemic terms? I mean, suppose there is significant variance in the use of epistemic terms, right? How are we then to answer the question? It would be, it seems to me, kind of ambiguous exactly which question is being asked. Because although you have a single term appearing in the question, it's used in many different ways. And so it is not clear which way is being used. when the question is being asked. What we could do, and ultimately I'm going to endorse something like this, is consider various ways in which the term is or might be used, and attempt to answer the question for each of those uses, at least insofar as we're interested in doing so. Here's another way to think about this, following sort of syntax offered by David Chalmers. Suppose there are 5 different ways the term no is being used. We may label them no 1, no 2, like subscripts here, like no 3, no 4, no 5. Then, what was initially one question, do we know anything? It is now 5, right? Do we know 1 anything? Do we know 2 anything? And so on. This is precisely my suggestion here. Explore the various uses of the term and answer the question on each of them insofar as we can, and care to do so. If we don't care to do so, then whatever, give it up. But yeah, this is how I'd want to proceed. So at this point, let's return to how the term knowledge is typically characterized, and we can continue with these kind of methodological ideas in mind. So before, I said that it was standardly taken that knowledge requires true belief. Another thing which is standardly taken to be a requirement for knowledge is that the belief must be justified in some sense, right? Indeed, the most common basic account of knowledge is as justified true belief. Or something near enough to that. Now, how the term justification is used, however, is far from clear and univocal. Sometimes, when that term is explained, it is explained in terms of other kind of normative vocabulary. So, for example, it's a belief is justified when it's the sort of belief that the subject has the epistemic right or warrant to have. And for me, when the explanation ends there, or with similar normative vocabulary, as it sometimes does regarding justification, I find myself wondering what's being said. As someone who finds this sort of discourse very unclear, if not largely void of meaning, there's not really much more that I can say. You say that you're in your quote unquote epistemic rights to hold a certain belief. I mean, what does that mean? What does that involve, at least like approximately? Intertwining this notion with other unclear normative vocabulary is of little help, at least to me. On the other hand, explanation of the term does not always end there. Many people and many philosophers writing on philosophy have offered further explanations. However, unfortunately, what we see in my experience is a sort of diverse proliferation of explanations rather than convergence on some single notion. Before considering some of those explanations, I want to consider the following question. Do these explanations involve elucidations of different uses of the same word? Or are they actual like competing descriptions of the same thing that we are typically talking about when we use the relevant terminology? So if the former, if they're just different uses of the same term, then apparent disagreements here are not really substantive. We would just be using the same term in different ways and making statements that sound incompatible but are not. Just like in the case where I say the bank is wet and you say the bank is not wet, we would not be having a substantive disagreement if you're using the term bank to talk about a financial institution, and I'm using it to talk about a riverbank, right? So although the sentence looks like the sentences look like they're in conflict, really they're not, because we're just using the same term in a different way. And similarly, when you say justification requires X, and I say justification does not require X, we would only be having a substantive disagreement if we're using the term justification in at least approximately the same way. We're talking about the same sort of thing. And if we're not, then the apparent disagreement there is illusory. An unfortunate consequence of using the same terminology in different ways. At this juncture, it may be relevant to mention other features of language. For example, concepts, meaning, reference, deference, and so on. For the purpose of this video, I feel that exploring those issues at much length will have kind of diminishing returns regarding the target question, which again concerns whether we know anything. Still, it is worth mentioning one possible response to the concern that disputes regarding what knowledge in general, or justification and warrant in particular, are terminological rather than substantive. That response involves the commitment to there being this thing, knowledge, an abstractly existing concept, perhaps, that we are expressing when we use the relevant terminology in a non-deviant way. While I do not affirm the existence of abstracta, even if I did, it's not clear to me that they could help here. After all, surely if there are concepts associated in some way with the term that we used, right, some abstract entities, the concepts so associated must vary with the way those terms are used. For some jargon, we might say that the way a term is used supervenes on the concept it expresses. If I use the term knowledge in one way and use it in another, it would make little sense to say that we invariably express the same abstract concept when we employ the term. On the contrary, if we do affirm the existence of abstract concepts like this, it seems to me that the right thing would be to say that there are different concepts expressed for different uses of the relevant vocabulary. No less than different concepts would be expressed when we use the term bank when talking about financial institutions, and when we use the term bank when talking about riverbanks. So accordingly, responses of this sort seem to me to be of little help in resolving the concern that the relevant disputes are not substantive. All right, now back to our discussion about how justification is characterized. So one thing often said is that justification is inferential. This isn't always said, and there's some notable views that do not agree with this, but it's something that's commonly said anyway. The idea is that some belief is justified if it is, in part because it was derived or inferred from some other belief or beliefs or attitudes more broadly. For example, we might say that my belief that it will rain tomorrow is justified if it is, in part because I inferred that belief from other beliefs I have concerning weather reporting and the general reliability of said reporting. Others, however, will say that, well, maybe some beliefs can be justified in this sort of way, but it's possible to have justified beliefs absent any inferences like that. So, for example, perhaps we are justified in believing P if it just seems to us that P, and we have no defeaters for our belief that P. This is something that phenomenal conservatives will say. Others will say things like, well, no, our justified beliefs are just those that we arrive at while kind of exhibiting the required epistemic virtues, as virtue epistemologists will say. Or, on the other hand, perhaps we're justified in some belief just in case the sort of cognitive mechanism that formed that belief reliably forms true beliefs, as reliabilists will say, even if it wasn't formed in a way that has some inferential structure. Or perhaps we first decide what beliefs for counting is justified, and may abstract some general principles of what justification is based on such judgments. And particularists will say certain things like this. As an aside, we might ask, what might we say about those who fervently disagree concerning the analysis of Gettier cases? It could be that, they have the same notion of knowledge or justification in mind, but one of them is really getting it wrong, at least, whether a person in a Gettier case counts as knowing something. Or it could be just that they have different notions of knowledge or justification. And on the one, the person in the Gettier case doesn't count as knowing something, and the other person is using the terms in a way such that they do. And that's kind of could be where it ends, right? They have different notions in mind. I think a lot of these are probably a lot of disagreements like that aren't substantive, right? They're not really disagreements because they have just different notions in mind, and you're exploring these cases where they disagree, or at least more precisely, don't return the same sort of judgment. Anyway, that's something to think about, which I'm not going to discuss more at present. And so I listed a few sort of views of justification. And well, I don't think it's going to be of significant use for me to, fill in further details on these various views, the variations of them, and the many others that have been developed over centuries. I will say, to me, I think it's obvious that, for example, the phenomenal conservative and the reliabilist are just not using the term justification in the same way. It seems like no less obvious than when we use the term bank in different ways, as described previously. They're just talking about different things, right? They have different sort of conditions for counting as such in mind when they use the term. When the reliabilist says that the reliability of the belief forming mechanism is what's required for justification, and the phenomenal conservative denies this, I mean, this dispute just simply is not substantive, right? They don't have the same notion in mind, and they're disagreeing over some requirement for its satisfaction. They have different notions in mind. They're using the term in different ways, and that leads them to state these apparently, but not actually, divergent judgments. So, so for me, instead, what I would want to do is that we can ask what the requirements are on the phenomenal conservatives' notion of justification, and we can ask what the requirements are for justification on the reliabilist sense, and so forth. This is my suggestion at the outset. Let's recognize the various uses of the term justification or knowledge, and attempt to answer the various questions we might have on each of them, insofar as we're interested in doing so, and able to do so, I suppose. Of course, where a dispute is terminological, there are often substantive disputes elsewhere. So, for example, the imagined phenomenal conservative and reliabilist may contend that the other is using the relevant terminology in their intended sense. For example, the reliabilist might contend that the phenomenal conservative actually is using the term in the reliabilist sense. They're just wrong about it. Or they might contend that people generally are using it one way or the other. The reliabilist might say that people are generally using the term knowledge or justification in some reliabilist way, or vice versa. And if the interlocutors disagreed over this, that's certainly a substantive disagreement. They're disagreeing about individual or general term use. And there's some fact of the matter there. They're not talking past each other when they say that. Of course, and if people generally are using it in a reliabilist way, then the reliabilist would be correct about that general use. That said, of course, if this were right, the phenomenal conservative is, they could just grant that, but choose to persist in their use, right, of the terms. General use does not determine how we use terms individually. Although there's some views of term use that are more externalist than I would want to grant that might deny that, but I'm not going to explore that. That's beyond the scope of this video. Now, if this is the sort of dispute we are going to turn to concerning general term use, then what remains is some empirical question concerning how people generally are using the relevant vocabulary. I don't think personally, I don't think a whole lot turns on that, but I'll make a couple of remarks about this. In my experience, I think the most common use of epistemic vocabulary is to express, agreement or disagreement with a belief, and or satisfaction or dissatisfaction with the way in which that belief was developed, or something in that ballpark. And while there's a lot more to say about this, including the invaluable social functions it serves and some interesting patterns that we can observe and follow in our judgments of these sorts, I strongly doubt that what's going to fall out of an accurate analysis of this general use will be some univocal account reflecting some common and precise epistemological view regarding knowledge or justification. That is to say, common use here falls well short of the precision and detail of these normal epistemological theories. If the phenomenal conservative says that people broadly are using terminology in the phenomenal conservativist way, I think they're just wrong. I don't think general use even comes remotely close to that sort of precision or meaning. And this could be wrong. There's some empirical question. I don't have a ton of knowledge about that. I mean, I've read some of the studies, concerning folk use, but that literature isn't huge. I haven't read a ton of it, and there's concerns about the methods being potentially limited and flawed. But regardless, that's what I have to go on that, and just reflections of observations of everyday use of the relevant vocabulary, how I think that kind of informally myself and others tend to use it. I think it's something kind of close to what I said. But whatever the fact is there, I don't think it's not really that much of significant philosophical interest. Right? It's just some empirical question concerning how people use some vocabulary. At most, an answer to this question might resolve certain meta-linguistic disputes, right? And provide yet another use of the epistemic vocabulary for which we can use to ask and potentially answer the target question. So we might say, do we know anything on the kind of general use of the term know? Speaking of which, what can we now say on that question? of whether we know anything. As I said near the outset, and a couple times since then, we may, if we want, outline the various senses of know, which we might label know one, know two, etc., and attempt to answer the question using each of them in turn. Of course, we could then run into certain methodological issues. How would we go about determining such facts regarding the term use, and the whether we know anything on some particular term? How would we resolve disputes? So we might agree on the sense of the term know in question, but people might disagree whether we or anyone know something in that sense of the term. At that point, we may hit roadblocks and face intractable disagreements. But it doesn't rule out that there's some fact of the matter there, or B, it doesn't stop us from coming to our own conclusions, and C, it certainly doesn't prohibit us from attempting to reach consensus. People might disagree over things, and they might persist in that disagreement, but I don't see why that would be some major issue at this point. So all this is coming to the point, which is like, do we know anything? I mean, in short, it depends on how we're using the term know. On some uses, we don't. On others, perhaps we do. What we count as knowing, if anything, is largely a matter of what the conditions for knowledge are as that term is being used. And it's going to also be partly a matter of the other facts about ourselves and the world. And this response kind of might be disappointing, but that's my answer. And I could start exploring different uses of the term know and trying to answer whether as far as I can tell, we know anything on that sense of the term. On the phenomenal conservative notion, we might fill in some of the details of what precisely that view, that use involves. But yeah, I guess, we count as knowing things. On certain reliabilist notions, yeah. I would say that we have fairly reliable belief forming mechanisms and so on. On certain contextualist or contrastivist notions, kind of trivially, there are things that we know. On other senses of knowledge, maybe we don't know anything at all, right? Either because of some intolerable regress or some other issue, which rules out, as a matter of fact, or perhaps as a matter of principle, that you can count as knowing anything. I'm fine with that. Like, let's just explore, if we want, which ones count as which. And that's going to involve elucidating the various notions of the term know that we might have in mind and analyzing accordingly. So I'm going to consider briefly 5 possible rejoinders. First, my comments here yet provide no resolution to common skeptical challenges, right? And so, doesn't the skeptical worry remain? This is kind of first concern that I might expect. Right? Where did I discuss, resolving external world skepticism or Cartesian doubts or regress concerns or whatever. And although it would be interesting to explore these things, I think the concern is misguided. To even fully characterize the skeptical worry and understand what would count as a successful response, requires first getting clearer on the conditions for knowledge as the term is being used. In other words, we're just going to have to explore the issues already raised. It could turn out that on the target or some target conception of knowledge, we don't count as knowing anything, or that we don't count as knowing that some skeptical thesis is false, right? That we're a brain in a vat or whatever. But without clarifying the target conception of knowledge, I don't even understand what the skeptical worry is saying, so that I might assess it. And if there's nothing in particular in mind, then the worry as presented is not even well formed, right? Let's get clear on what the conditions for knowledge are. It could turn out that my belief that I have hands or whatever doesn't satisfy the requirements for knowledge so understood, and so I don't count as knowing that. And the quote unquote skeptical worry is correct. Whether it's correct depends on what the conditions for knowledge are as using the term, and whether I ever satisfy those conditions, or at least satisfy them in the for those beliefs in question. But that's the main project, and I'm this response that I didn't really assess the skeptical challenges kind of misses the point entirely. All right, so second concern. Well, hang on, but if on the target conception of knowledge, we admit that we don't know anything, wouldn't our position be self-defeating? Generally speaking, my answer is no. Of course, someone who denies that we have knowledge in some target sense may have other commitments in tension with that. But the mere position that we don't have knowledge in some target sense is consistent, unless the notion of knowledge we have in mind is one on which the nihilistic thesis or the affirmation of it is contradictory. That strange possibility aside, merely denying that we have knowledge in some sense doesn't admit to self-defeat. Denying that we have knowledge on normal uses doesn't entail that there are no true beliefs, or that we cannot make true statements. And one of those could be the nihilistic thesis, right? So the nihilistic thesis could be consistent. The nihilists could be consistent in their affirming it, but they would just deny that it's something that they know is true, even though on their view it is true. They would deny that they know anything, including the claim just expressed. That all seems to me entirely consistent. Our third concern, well, it might be suggested that my kind of rather deflationary approach to epistemological issues fails to take seriously the fact that knowledge is integral to inquiry and belief formation, and that without it, inquiry is kind of effectively aimless. Consider Descartes' meditations, for example. He wasn't concerned merely with checking whether his beliefs satisfied some condition. He was sort of engaging in a procedure of redeveloping his beliefs systematically from solid foundations, or so he claimed anyway. And so regardless of what we make of his project, the general point is that we might think of these epistemic notions as playing some guiding role in how we develop and update our beliefs. We strive to believe that for which we have justification, and avoid believing that for which we lack it, for example. But if justification is unattainable, we're never justified in any beliefs, and we can't be, then if we maintain these epistemic principles, wouldn't we be motivated to neutrality as far as we could? If we want to only believe which is just that which is justified, and justification is unattainable, then we would just want to dispense with all of our beliefs as far as we can. But I don't, you might think of it this way, but I don't think that we or the nihilist has to maintain these principles or others with similar consequences. We or the nihilist could be content to have our beliefs, update them in some way or another, and not attempt to engage in some sort of inquiry that takes knowledge or justification as its target. You could take truth as your target and try as best you can, even though on your own view, none of the beliefs you form will count as knowledge. That could be, again, entirely consistent. Fourth, it might be contested I've been sort of neglecting the normative aspect of epistemology. On some views, there are just these objective facts concerning right reason, and what we should or shouldn't believe, and so forth. On such views, we might say that maintaining our beliefs despite nihilism would be epistemically irresponsible, which poses a serious problem for nihilism. It's not enough to say that we aren't interested in abiding by these norms. We are doing something really wrong by violating them. Now, those familiar with my views on these kind of issues may anticipate my response. In short, I can sort of make little sense of these epistemic realist commitments generally. Without clarification, talk about what we should or shouldn't believe, for example, in the realist intended sense of the terms, is to me just completely mysterious. I don't know what's being said, and strongly suspect that the discourse involves commitments which are deeply confused. Bracketing that, though, I don't even see how this would pose a serious problem for the nihilist. Suppose that the normative claims are intelligible and that the nihilist understands and even grants their relevant normative claims. They might simply accept that they're violating them and carry on as they desired. They just might not be interested in following those norms. I'm not sure what the major problem for their view would be. Fifth, and finally, at least for what I'm going to cover here, certainly there's more things that might be said. Someone might allege that my discussion here is self-undermining, regardless whether nihilism itself is inconsistent. You might retort, but if I'm open to epistemic nihilism, am I not admitting that perhaps none of my claims are justified, and so none of my arguments serve as justifiers? And if so, why would anyone take anything I've said here seriously? Again, if the target notion of knowledge is one on which none of my beliefs or claims are justified, then so be it, right? It's a further question how people might react to my comments or arguments, given this fact or my admission of it. If someone isn't interested in entertaining my thoughts because on some target conception of knowledge, I contend that I don't know anything, well, of course, that's their prerogative. Personally, I have no such attitude. I think that inquiry, disagreement, and discourse can proceed as effectively as it does, even if dispensed with epistemic talk altogether. Although I might see some point in reviving that vocabulary in a more useful way than on some nihilistic conception, but that's a point for another time, right? So, in sum, I guess all I'm doing is trying to report the facts as best I can. If someone finds my reports disagreeable, then that can be discussed. I expect that we could. If someone isn't willing to take me seriously or engage with me because of the reports that I make, well, then my remarks are for another. I should add one further point, although I didn't make note of this as a sixth retort, which is that someone could say a lot of what you're looking to do when avoiding skepticism is convince the skeptic. What sort of argument could you present to the skeptic to convince them of some non-skeptical beliefs, for example, that we have hands or whatever. And I think this is kind of strange, this kind of approach. I mean, whether someone is convinced by something is some psychological feature. Not sure why that would be relevant to whether we count as satisfying some condition for knowledge. Is whether we can convince a certain person of something one such requirement? Maybe on the way you're using the term or someone's using the term, but that seems really strange. I don't. Someone could be a global skeptic. I don't know if I could convince them of much, but whether I can or can't, it seems to me an entirely separate question. Whether some beliefs I have satisfy the conditions for knowledge as we're using the term. So this talk about whether you can convince or whether the arguments you present would be begging the question or whatever against the skeptic just seems to me irrelevant to the target question. So that's kind of wraps up my thoughts there. So, and as you check how much time is left in this video, you might recall that at the outset I promised to discuss a related topic, presuppositionalism, or at least a presuppositionalist argument, or type of them. And what I have in mind for my discussion here is an argument, or really a family of arguments, for the existence of God that proceeds something like this. Premise 1, if we have knowledge, then God exists. Premise 2, we have knowledge. Conclusion, God exists. Now, I mean, there's more things that presuppositionalists sometimes say regarding these premises, in particular, the first premise. But my response to this argument is going to be perfectly general. Specify how you're using the term knowledge when you state that argument, right? You say, premise 1 says, if we have knowledge, then God exists. Well, in the antecedent there, that term knowledge, what does that mean? What are the conditions for knowledge, quote unquote, as they're using that term? Either it's going to turn out that knowledge in that sense that you have in mind is compatible with the non-existence of God. And I mean, if I think that we have knowledge in that sense, I'm just going to deny that first premise, right? If we don't have knowledge in that sense, then I'm just going to end up denying two instead. Or the notion of knowledge that you have in mind is not compatible with the non-existence of God, right? In which case, I'm going to deny the second premise, right, which says that we do have knowledge. On the latter, you can imagine someone's using the term knowledge in the following sort of way. It's to count as knowing something requires by definition that God communicates with us in some way, right? He reveals to us that such and such is the case, and that's a requirement on this use of the term that someone might have in mind, that that's a requirement for knowledge. And someone could use the term that way. That could be what they mean by know. It could involve something to do with revelation. And, well, I don't accept that there are any gods. I deny that there are any gods. And so, let alone that any communicate with us. And so I would accordingly deny that I or anyone knows anything at all in this sense of the term. I mean, I don't think of this as a concession at all. Why would an atheist or agnostic be committed to believing that we know anything in that sense of the term know? that would just be tantamount to the commitment that God exists and communicates with us in certain ways. To the contrary, I would expect them to deny it or, remain agnostic, perhaps. By analogy, suppose that on my use of the term know, we count as knowing something only if we observe a sort of statement of it in English written in the stars in the sky. We don't, I don't think I've ever observed anything like that. And so, on that sense, for the term know, certainly the nihilist conclusion is right. I don't know anything. No one does. I suppose it's in principle possible, perhaps, that people know things, but as a matter of contingent fact, nobody does. That's not a concession. That's just accurately reporting whether our beliefs satisfy that criteria or not. They don't. None of them do. And so we don't count as knowing anything in that sense of the term. You might remark that, of course, my usage of the term is very unusual. We don't build in some feature of star rating into our notion of the term knowledge. Yeah, I would agree with that. But I'm going to say the same thing about some use of the term knowledge in a way the possession of which requires the existence of God. I don't think that's common use. That's a really strange use of the term, though. So as an exercise, I would like to invite you to consider again the 5 rejoinders that I brought up to this. I want to consider those with respect to this notion of knowledge here. Well, either the star writing case or the God revealing it to us case. I'll leave that as an exercise. Now, strictly speaking, someone might be very committed to the view that we have knowledge in some particular sense of the term. And, they may come to realize that having knowledge in that sense requires the existence of God, or at least makes likely the existence of God. And they might believe in God on that basis. However, this is not at all the position in which I suspect many atheists and agnostics find themselves. For us, this sort of presuppositionalist argument will carry little or no force at all, and requires no further consideration. Rather, what we're going to do is say, okay, you have some notion of knowledge which doesn't require the existence of God. Well, then how is it an argument for the existence of God? Or we're going to say you have some notion of knowledge in mind, the possession of which does require the existence of God. Okay, I don't know anything in that sense of the term. Let's move on. So I think that's kind of all there is to say, or at least that's enough to dismiss with that line of reasoning, at least for me. Anyway, that's going to do it for today. I'm very interested in your thoughts. What do you think about the remarks that I've made? What do you wish that I cover that I didn't cover or didn't cover enough? Let me know, either in the comments or in the Discord server. I would like to especially thank the patrons to the channel. Currently, that's Ninjabem, Realistic Nihilist, Johnson AV, Felix, Mars Bars, Rish, Sean, Sully, Joe, and Eddie. If you'd like to join their ranks, get some nice perks, support the channel, and more content like this, please check out patreon.com/friction and consider joining. If we get to $200 a month, I'll make at least 2 long-form video essays like this per month. Anyway, thanks everyone for watching, subscribing, and I'll see you in the next one.